Hello there. What are the main causes of persistent high absolute poverty in many of the lowest income countries in the world? Let's spend a few minutes thinking about that as part of our revision of poverty and inequality economics. The World Bank defines poverty in absolute terms. Well, what is absolute poverty? Well, it's when a household doesn't have enough resources, sufficient income, sufficient resources, including savings, to sustain a basic, acceptable standard of living and to meet our essential core needs. The World Bank actually defines extreme or absolute poverty as living on less than $1.90 a day PPP, and they define moderate extreme poverty as less than $3.10 a day PPP. There remains a cluster of countries where the per capita national income at or around or below $1,000 a year, and Burundi is a really good example of that. Here are two countries, Burundi and the Central African Republic. The latest figures for built into the 2020 Human Development Report show Burundi and the Central African Republic with a GNI, a gross national income, below $1,000 in real terms, adjusted for PPP. And you can see there's a cluster of countries, all with a very high ranking on HDI in terms of low HDI score, at or around $1,500 a year. This is extreme poverty. Indeed, in some countries, the majority of a population live on less than $1.90 a day PPP. Madagascar is a good example, with over 3/4 of their population on the latest data living below that absolute poverty threshold. And in many countries, including, for example, populous countries such as Nigeria, over half the population live on less than $1.90 a day. One of the questions that I asked my students this week in class was this one. What do you think is the fundamental factor determining per capita incomes in most countries? And we had a very interesting discussion built around things like institutions and innovation and investment and education and healthcare. Many interesting factors came up in discussion. But I think the fundamental factor is productivity. Indeed, many economists believe that the level of labour productivity, output per person employed or output per hour worked, shown in this chart, is the biggest single driver determinant of per capita incomes and ultimately progress in cutting extreme poverty. What I've done here is I've taken a chart created from the brilliant website Our World in Data, ourworldindata.org. And I'm going to post a link to this chart in the comments section of this video, because you can create your own chart and add or take away countries of your choice. So please do follow the link, because then you'll be able to create a chart and maybe a resource for your notes. What I'm showing here is that countries such as South Korea and South Africa recently, and Nigeria, China and India are lifting per capita incomes. South Korea is a really interesting success story in terms of moving from a relatively low income country to becoming a high income advanced country, whereas Malaysia and South Africa have reached a certain level of productivity but don't seem to have improved much since. They seem to be stuck in a middle income trap perhaps. Productivity isn't everything, according to the economist Paul Krugman, but in the long run it's almost everything. The ability to improve living standards over time, according to Krugman, depends almost entirely on its ability to raise output per worker. Of course, this invites a much wider discussion about what are the determinants of productivity. So I would argue that to reduce extreme poverty, to bring down absolute poverty globally and country by country, we need to lift productivity. So this poses an interesting question. What factors might be holding back the value of labour productivity in many of the lower income countries in the world? Now, there are many factors. Again, we discussed this in class this week, and there were some great contributions and some really interesting ideas. Partly, of course, can we measure productivity? Not every output has a physical, tangible output. Not every output is sold in a market at a price. So there are big methodological issues about whether we're measuring productivity accurately. That being said, here are 7 things that I think can hold back productivity. One is that in many of the low-income countries, urbanisation is low. The majority of people may live in rural areas, perhaps living in subsistence agriculture, and no country on the planet has really grown rich without first urbanising. Yes, there are problems associated with density of population in urban areas, including crime and the spread of disease and pressure on scarce resources. But there are also positive externalities from high density which can lift productivity in the economy. So I think urbanisation is a key factor. Crucially, productivity can be held back by weaknesses in human capital, which we generally refer to as the quality of the labour force. The great development economist Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard, at the Centre for International Development at Harvard, talks about the importance of know-how. It's not just skills, it's not just qualifications or experience, but it's that wider concept of know-how which can be so important in developing the range of products, the capabilities of products and goods and services that countries can make. Productivity is often held back by chronic critical infrastructure gaps, including intermittent electricity, poor broadband access, limited power, limited access to roads and rail and port facilities and things. Huge issue, can't get away from this, is the extent to which productivity is held back by persistent embedded gender inequalities, which means we're not making the most of all of our workforce, of all of our citizens of a country. And many of you will be familiar with the whole issue of malnourishment and the debilitating impact that can have on health and ultimately on productivity. In many low-income countries also, because per capita incomes are fairly low, they are low in absolute terms, the level of market demand is also fairly low, and that can limit the ability of a country and businesses within it to exploit economies of scale, increasing returns to scale within key sectors such as farming or household manufacturing or construction, who knows. So in countries where there aren't those big firms, those highly productive businesses, including state-owned enterprises, again, that can hold back productivity. I think generally another key factor is in many low-income countries there is heavy dependence on fairly low value-added sectors. So a country might be pretty good at growing tomatoes or cocoa or rubber, for example, extracting and growing from beneath the ground, but not necessarily have the capability and capacity to process and retail and manufacture and brand things, where the value added at different stages of production can be particularly important. So I think this slide really highlights some of the key factors holding back labour productivity, which I think is one of the key factors maintaining absolute poverty. We think about human capital. I'll show you a chart, some tables here showing the mean years of schooling for selected countries. And these countries, you can see this column 2 and 3 here. There's often a big gap between expected years of schooling, in other words, what is technically available to children from a young age all the way through to tertiary and post-school education, and the mean years of schooling, which is the kind of average number of years of school that a child can expect. So in Niger, for example, it's just over 2. In Rwanda, it's just over 4. In India, the mean years of schooling is effectively just over half of the expected years. And that clearly education and human capital must have an effect on national income per capita over time. It's not just, of course, the access to schooling, it's the quality of teaching and much else besides. This next table, I think, is quite stark. It's the percentage of population with at least some secondary education. I'm taking the data, by the way, from the 2020 Human Development Report. And again, I'll post a link in the comments section of the video. But this is quite a stark table, is it not? This is the percentage of the population, all ages, with at least some secondary education. And rounding down to one decimal place, in Timor-Leste and Madagascar, it is 0. And then you can see the percentage rising with a selection of countries. I've put in there countries like India, for example, now 40%, Bangladesh 44%, and Thailand 46%. Undernourishment, poor nutrition, is a fundamental aspect of absolute and extreme poverty. This chart, again from Our World in Data, shows the share of the population that are undernourished in 2017. The darker the red area on the orange area, the greater is the incidence of undernourishment, defined as having a food energy intake which is lower than an individual's requirement, taking into account their age, gender, height, weight, and economic activity levels. And so I focus on productivity, but there are other, often related, main causes. There's no single cause of absolute poverty. Oftentimes these policies are interrelated, and causation can work both ways. Just want to pick out a few of them in this final slide with some graphics. One is that in many low-income countries, a high percentage of people work in farming, extractive growing sectors, and world prices are volatile and fluctuate, and often small-scale farmers have little or no bargaining power in any market, be it national, regional or international. Often they're vulnerable to the monopoly power of the big multinational manufacturing, food processing businesses. So low and unstable household incomes can act as a major barrier to progress in reduced poverty, particularly when there's limited savings, etc. I'm going across the top row here, but in many countries the government simply doesn't have the tax revenue to be able to provide an effective and sufficiently scoped financial welfare safety system. So things like the welfare benefits that in the UK we don't take for granted, but which are there, they're not there in many low-income countries. There can be poor access to and affordability of basic goods and services, basic public goods and merit goods, including education and healthcare. In many countries, per capita income is held back by high unemployment and persistently high underemployment, hidden unemployment, if you like, where people working in the vulnerable informal economy, where incomes and wages are very low. I've mentioned dependence on low value-added industries. That is something that is fundamental to bringing down extreme poverty. You have to increase the capacity and the capabilities of your industries, and the debilitating impact of malnutrition has been mentioned already. So there we go. We've taken a look over the last few minutes about some of the main causes of persistent high absolute poverty rates, and in the next video we'll just recap some of the major policies that might be addressed in a pro-poor sense to bring down the rate of extreme poverty in the world economy. Okay, thank you very much indeed.